So on page 3, we haven't discussed this yet, of course, but you have Porter's 5 forces model. There's a scenario, and then and then some questions. Now, we will do this in class, and you can work together in 2 on a team, okay? Just to go over it. So we're going to do one tonight. The next one is the Pestle toolkit. We're going to do this tonight after I cover it in the slides. So you'll do this tonight. I'm going to give you 45 minutes to work on this, okay? But of course, when you go to turn it in, you want to make sure you're turning in the polished copy, okay? Does that make sense?
And the assignment criteria, how we will do it.
Well, it's pretty much covered in here. It's just a series. It's just as well. It's a case, almost like a mini case study with. Well, we'll go over it. I'll go over it later. Yeah, the pestle we're going to do tonight. I'm going to give you about 45 minutes to work on it. All right. So that has to be turned in as a soft copy. Then you have this balanced scorecard that has to be turned in as a soft copy. And then there's a couple of shorties called Net Promoter Score, non-financial KPIs. We covered financial and non-financial today. An operating profit margin. And I will give you this operating profit margin. They just stuck this in here. I will give you the formula of how to do that tomorrow. Okay? So all of that, up until page 12, all of that has to be turned in after 30 days as a soft copy. Everybody got that? That's all soft copy. Along with your final assignment, which is also soft copy, obviously. And the workbook has to be turned in the day of your first class, the next class. This gets turned in as hard copy. Everybody got that? So, the section in here through page 12, soft copy turned in by the 18th, final assignment turned in by the 18th, and the group project is turned in by the 18th. This gets turned in the first day of your next class.
Next month.
Yeah, next month.
When it will be next month?
I don't know, 4 Fridays. Everybody got that? Make sure everybody understands that now? So everything in this book, plus your group project, is soft copy in your final assignment. This book you have to complete and turn in the hard copy the first day of your next class. Everybody understands, right? You want me to say it again? I don't want to say it again. My voice, I'm not going to have any voice by the end of the night anyway. So, and we will go over all that. The pestle analysis that we're going to do tonight, the 5 forces model, we'll do that tomorrow. And the rest of this stuff is just kind of short stuff. Those are the two big toolkit problems that we'll work on in class. They like us to do those in class. So, but the work you do in class, of course, you want to create a finished copy that you're going to be turning in. Okay, does that make sense? But I'll give you time in class because that's the way the program is set up. So we'll probably pick, I don't know, it'll be probably somewhere around 45 minutes. You read the case study, and then it's going to ask you some questions on the pestle analysis. But it's after I cover it in the next, it's in this next slide program. Okay. And I'm shooting to finish tonight somewhere between 8:30 and 8:45. Is that all right for everybody?
Yeah.
Okay. Because actually we're a little bit ahead. And I don't. I'm afraid if I go to 9 o'clock, you may be picking me off the floor tonight. So I don't want to pass out in front of everybody. But I'm getting a little. This bronchitis I got is really taking a toll on me. I apologize for that. I actually picked it up the last class I did in Riyadh. That's where I got this. And I think it's the traveling on these planes is really getting tough. Okay. So we're going to look at some environmental scanning, SWOT analysis. There is a SWOT analysis in your workbook. Has anybody ever done one of these? I mean, they're fairly common, and they're fairly simplistic. So basically, the environmental scanning SWOT analysis, this is what we do in the first step of the strategic planning, is a survey of the organization's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. It integrates information regarding external environment and organization's capabilities. So external environment is everything that's outside the company. It impacts the company, but the company doesn't control it. That is called external environment. Things like the economy, things like government regulations, unions, customers, suppliers, all of those are part of the external environment. They impact your company, but you have no control over them. Does that make sense? Internal capabilities is basically the internal environment. In the internal environment, there isn't much there. It's people, process, policies, procedures. That's part of your internal environment. That's what you do control. Okay? So anything that impacts your company you don't control is part of the external environment. And in the PESTEL analysis, that's what you're measuring, the external environment. Okay? So the SWOT requires analytical input from a diverse group of core business areas. Typically, when the senior management team does an assessment in order to create strategy, they'll start with the SWOT. And the diverse group of core business areas are going to be basically your functional areas, the heads of your main departments, accounting, finance, IT, engineering, research and development, HR, operations, marketing and sales, and so on. So input during this period must be brutally honest, creative, thorough, and comprehensive. So if you think about it this way, well, that's not too bad. We used to refer to this as the strategic table, or sometimes they used to just call it the big table. And this is done typically when a company is going to be setting up its strategy. Now here, just for argument's sake, you have your CEO. Here you would have your finance, head of finance. Here you'd probably have marketing, sales. Here you might have IT. Here you would have head of operations. And here you would have HR. Should be 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think I got them all. Did I leave anybody out? I don't think so. No, that's there. I got them all. It gets late at night. Sometimes supply chain basically it could be part of operations. I mean, this is the accepted 5 core functional areas of business, but it may not fit your particular business model. So it doesn't, like, supply chain may be a very important part of your business. That could be one of your core functions. But typically, in a typical organization, you have 5. We'll see them again later. It comes up on one of my slides. So you sit around the strategic table, and this is where you start to formulate what our strategies are going to be. Now, the CEO is depending on the heads of these departments to give honest, brutally honest input, because you don't want to formulate strategies that aren't going to work. So this is kind of a brainstorming session, if you will. And as an example, let's say you work for a baby products company, and they're looking to expand their global reach and expand their market share. Well, the marketing guy will say, why don't we look towards the Asian continent, particularly China, because it's got the biggest population in the world. What better place to expand our baby product business? The HR guy, well, wait a minute, China's not such a good pick because they have a 1-child per household law. So you see where I'm going? You have to be brutally honest. So you kind of back and forth with this stuff, okay, before you start to formulate what your long-term strategies are going to be. And that's done at the big table. So all these people should have earned a seat at that big table. The last person to actually earn a seat at that table was HR. HR never was invited to the table for many years because they weren't considered to be a strategic part of the organization. Okay. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's where the SWOT begins. So you have positive and negative, internal and external. So the strengths, of course, would be internal strengths. Infrastructure in place, location is highly suitable, very focused management staff, well-rounded management business. So you basically plug in what are your specific business strengths, internal. What are your specific weaknesses? Again, you have to be brutally honest here. Okay? Where are we weakest? Where do we enjoy where do we enjoy the strengths? Where do we have liabilities because of weakness? Then you look externally. Where are there opportunities that we could basically explore that we haven't explored before? Likewise, what threats are out there externally that we have to be careful with? An example of a threat. What's an example of a threat? If you're putting together a strategy, what could be an example of an external threat?
Shortage of raw materials, maybe?
It could be. Over government regulation in a particular area could be another one. Okay.
The country that I'm willing to invest in is not stable politically.
Political unrest. Maybe they don't have the infrastructure to transport your product. Maybe they have shortage of skilled people. All of those could be threats to your strategic plan. Okay, good. So that's basically what you do with the SWOT analysis. So some of the questions that you may ask: strengths. What do we do exceptionally well? What advantages do we have as a company? What valuable assets and resources do we have? Okay, so we're looking at resources. Remember we talked about resources before. What do members or customers identify as our strengths? Key questions for weaknesses. What could we do better? What are we criticized for or receive the most complaints about? And where are we vulnerable? Now, externally, opportunities. What opportunities do we know about but have not addressed? Are there emerging trends on which we could capitalize? And threats, of course. Are our weaknesses likely to make us critically vulnerable in the external market? What external roadblocks exist that block our progress? Is there significant change coming in our members' sector? Are economic conditions affecting our financial viability? So those would be all threats. And this is kind of a SWOT analysis typically is more of what we call scratching of the surface, which is why typically you do a SWOT first, and then you get into the more depth with the pestle analysis. Does that make sense? So you have a sample SWOT in your workbook. And all you do is just come up with some processes in there. So we go to the macro environment, which is the environment external to the organization, its operations and its industry. So external environment is something they call the macro environment. Macro environmental factors strongly influence the strategy of an organization, must adopt to compete successfully within its markets and remain profitable. You have to know what your external environment looks like in order to be able to compete and remain profitable, particularly if you're looking at expansion. The organization has little to no influence over these external factors, as I mentioned. The most important element in a macro environment is the direction in which that environment is trending. So one of the best tools for considering trends in the macro environment is the pestle analysis, which looks like this. So, pestle examines, as an example, if you're expanding your business into another country, Do you have to consider political factors? Obviously, you would. Economic factors, social factors, technology factors. If you're a high-tech company, would you move your company to a place where you can't even get internet? You know, that's a technology factor. Legal factors and environmental factors. So the pestle elements, political can be things like taxation, minimum wage requirements, export incentives, government stability. Economic factors can be how much capital is available, what does the labor pool look like, what kind of resources are there. Social are trends against, that should be trends, by the way, trends against unhealthy activities, wealth, and demographic trends. Technology. You have to consider disruptive technology, technology that appears with very little warning but has a significant impact on how your business is conducted in an industry. Obsolescence of technology, development of new technology to remain competitive. The legal side of pestle, closely related to political conditions, but it is the results of political decisions, meaning laws and legislation. Some countries may present a big negative with their legislative process where an expansion into that country might not be the best thing. Okay? Impacting labor requirements, regulatory compliance, environmental, financial, safety and health requirements, product standards, all of these have to be looked at when you're looking at strategic, particularly strategic expansion. Licensing, permits, tariffs, import-export requirements, and fines. Environmental, you have to look at the carbon footprint. Ever know what carbon footprint means? I don't want to use terms you're not familiar with.
Carbon footprint is an effect on environment.
Yeah, it's like what a company leaves behind. Have like a mining operation, for example. Mining operation closes down and moves somewhere else. What are they leaving behind? A lot of mining slag, polluted water, polluted ground, and so on. That's called, the size of your carbon footprint. Also, environmental, you have to look at compliance, ethics, corporate social responsibility, customer demands regarding environmental impact of corporations. So, next one's competitive. Oh, I got a great story for competitive intelligence. Now you'll like. A true story. So, that's the pestle. Everybody got it? Let's turn to, I think it's page 6. No, it's not. Where is it? Yeah, it is page 6. Pestle. Pestle analysis. So, what I want you to do, and you can do this in teams of 2, or you can do it in a team of 1 if you're shy. Here's the scenario. You, meaning you, are head of sales and marketing and a member of the strategic management team for a medium-sized organization that manufactures and sells specialized oil and gas exploratory drilling and production equipment to a wide range of global oil and gas companies. One of the major initiatives being considered by the strategic team is expanding existing U.S.-based manufacturing operations of this equipment to both South America and the African continent to reduce shipping distance of material and establish a local presence. That make sense so far? Okay. So, the targeted country in Africa being considered is Nigeria, which would allow shipment of equipment to African oil producers in Angola, Ivory Coast, Ghana, Cameroon, Gabon, DRC, and Equatorial Guinea. DRC is the Democratic Republic of Congo, I believe. The targeted country in Latin America under consideration is Venezuela, which would allow shipment of equipment to Latin American oil producers in Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia. So, the company's CEO asks you to prepare an environmental scan that will focus on key strategic decision-making that needs to be examined for both countries under consideration, Venezuela and Nigeria, and to be, quote, brutally honest in your evaluation and comments. So in order to perform accumulation of basic information, you will utilize the PESTLE tool and perform a basic PESTLE analysis covering specific areas that are of strategic concern. Now, you can also use in class, you have internet access? I mean, you can look stuff up on the internet if you want to. I mean, feel free. Your team assignment is to discuss and prepare a list of topics that should be considered from a strategic point of view, listing topics of concern under each of the PESTLE categories: political concerns, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental. Break into teams, develop a strategy to address these issues, be prepared to discuss your solutions and strategy. Everybody got it? Yes? Not too complex? So it's kind of a mini case study. I have a big trouble with case studies because I always find case studies too blasted long. Pages. So I fixed that about 2 years ago. I started just writing my own. So I actually wrote that case study. It's short and to the point. So using the PESTLE, go down the list, PESTLE, list the pros and cons for each country, and then at the bottom of the thing, after it's all done, your analysis, pick which of the two countries you feel is the better investment. And you will find, of course, through your examination, that both have a lot of liabilities. So the question is, which one has less liability? Because you can't say, well, I think we'd rather go to Argentina. You can't do that. It has to be either Nigeria or Venezuela. The funny thing is, when I wrote this, Venezuela wasn't doing too well, but that was months ago. And now it's really bad. So, but it doesn't change the PESTLE analysis. I wanted to talk about competitive intelligence. How do we gather information on our competitors? So the process of collecting and analyzing information about competitors' strengths and weaknesses in a legal and ethical manner to enhance business decision making. Why did they put that in there, in a legal and ethical manner? Why would they have that in there? Collecting and analyzing information about our competitors' strengths and weaknesses in a legal and ethical manner. Yeah. Well, exactly. I mean, basically, what they're talking about is like corporate espionage. Okay. I mean, that would not be considered ethical. Okay. So there are many ways of collecting that kind of information. So competitive intelligence activities can be basically grouped into two main types: tactical, which is shorter term and seeks to provide input into issues such as capturing market share or increasing revenues. Strategic, which focuses on longer term issues such as key risks and opportunities facing the enterprise. Now, if you were trying to get some competitive intelligence on your on your business rival, what about what if it's a washing machine company? Could you buy one of their washing machines and basically take it apart and re-engineer it? I mean, would that be considered ethical? Yeah, well, it's an individual call. I don't consider it unethical. I mean, you're free to buy their product. You're free to take their product apart. So when you're talking about what's ethical and what's unethical, it's sometimes a toss-up. Competitive intelligence is different from corporate or industrial espionage, which uses illegal and unethical methods to gain an unfair competitive advantage. So that would be basically stealing your competitor's company information. could be stealing sales lists, could be stealing, I don't know, engineering drawings, blueprints. I mean, things like that would be considered theft. Now, I'll give you a scenario. It's a true story. Many years ago, I was operating a temporary help business. So basically, I dealt with clients. If they had somebody going on vacation, like a secretary, they'd call me. I would send in a temporary secretary for a 2-week period. It could be a secretary, it could be engineering people, it could be clerical people, it could even be factory workers, okay? So basically, you have a pay rate that you pay the people, and then you have a billing rate that you charge the client. Make sense? So, I have a secretary, let's say I pay her $15 an hour. I may bill the client $25 or $30 an hour, okay? So typically the markup, it varies by the job, of course, but typically the markup would be somewhere in the 40 to 45% bracket, typically. On higher level jobs, your markup would be that much more, okay? I mean, I've seen markups as high as 55, 60%, which isn't bad. Does that make sense? So, here's the deal. I've opened up my temporary help business. I have 2 competitors in the same town, both of whom are really international, like the big guns. One is called Manpower, and the other was called Kelly Services, both of whom, Kelly Services is national, Manpower is actually international. So they're big. They're big temporary help firms. And when I came into this very small town in northeastern Pennsylvania, these were the 2 groups I had to compete with. Very difficult for a small guy to come in and compete against national or even an international firm. And it all really comes down to 2 things. It's attracting good people, okay? But of course, to attract good people, you have to pay well. The other thing, of course, is how much you're billing your customer. So, number one, if you don't have good people, then your customer's not going to use you. If you don't pay your people enough, you're going to hire people that really aren't qualified, so when you send them in for an assignment, they're going to bomb, and then the company probably won't use you again. So it's kind of a delicate balance here. Does that make sense? So, the key to this whole system is knowing the pay rate and the billing rate of your competitors. Now, pay rates, how can you find out what your pay rates are? In other words, how can I find out what Manpower and Kelly Services are paying people that work for them? Yeah, well, I mean, sometimes people will register with more than one temporary agency. So as I'm interviewing people, say, oh, I see you work for Manpower. How much do they pay you there for this job? And so on and so forth. That's one way. The hard thing, of course, is finding out billing rates, because no company is going to tell you the billing rate that they're paying. So you have to do some competitive intelligence. And what I did, I went after Manpower, actually, because they were the big gun. Manpower was down the street from my office. They were in a much nicer building, of course, because they had lots of money. But of course, they had a lot of overhead. And one of the funny things that they did every night, I observed them. First of all, I sent my marketing person in there, who was a very attractive blonde woman, okay? And she wore a black wig and disguised herself. And she went and applied for a job. And she got some of their pay rate information that way. But the billing rate was the key. So once I knew what the pay rates were and I could find a billing rate, I could basically come up with a billing rate that would undercut them, and I could actually start to steal their clients. Does that make sense? Am I in the unethical category yet? Okay. So, the only basic way to find out what their billing rate was to go down to their office late at night and do dumpster diving. Anybody know what dumpster diving is? You dive into their dumpster, the garbage dumpster, and you start ripping open bags to see what you can find. And lo and behold, after dumpster diving, I found a lot of their spreadsheets that they never bothered to shred that had client lists on them, and it had their billing rates. Okay? So once I had that information, not only did I have the billing rate, but I had the client list. So I was able to call clients and say, by the way, you know, if you'd like to try my services, I can give you a better price than the service you're using right now. So I used to undercut them by about maybe 15%. And little by little, I built my business up that way. So when I hit my third year, that was my first year of business, I did $1.5 million in sales. Not bad. Small little town. I'm going back 20, 25 years ago, okay? So the question comes up, is what I did legal? And the second question is, even if it was legal, was it ethical? What do you think?
It is legal, but not ethical.
Wasn't ethical. Why?
Yeah, we're trying to get information they will not share it with you.
Yeah, that's right.
So this is not ethical.
But remember, strategy, remember on one of the first slides we saw today? Strategy is about what? Winning, right? So it's not ethical. Anybody agree with that? It's not ethical. Okay. I can't talk for other countries. But in the United States, once you throw something away and it becomes garbage, okay, it's open to public domain. What does that mean?
As per the law. As per the law.
Well, as per law, yeah. So once something is tossed away as garbage, it becomes public domain. You have a right to go through anybody's garbage. There's no law that says you can't look through someone's garbage. In other words, once you throw it away, you no longer have that ownership connection, okay? So that's what I based my actions on, as being both legal and ethical. Now, you be the judge. Probably to this day, the people at Manpower are trying to figure out how I found out all of their rates. Hey, they should have bought a paper shredder. Simple investment. I had one. So that's a real case scenario of competitive intelligence. But even if it was illegal, the statute of limitations has already expired, so they can't arrest me now.
Is this the only way that they can get this information?
Is it the only way?
I'm saying nowadays there is a lot of ways to.
Well, nowadays there's so much technical information out there, or technology. You can probably get more information through technology, but back in those days, I'm going back before that technology was available. It was like at least 25 years ago. Okay. So today, of course, you can find out a lot more information by researching on the internet. So, I mean, I wouldn't recommend dumpster diving anymore, but of course I was a lot younger then. I was like 30 years old. So, but that was more than 25 years ago. It was probably more like 35 years ago. What's that?
Why wouldn't you recommend it now? Do you think it's unethical?
Well, no, it's kind of grimy. You know, jumping in somebody's garbage can. But, you know, when you're starting a business up, you do what you need to do to survive. So, The competitive intelligence process, this model actually is in your workbook, by the way. Everything you need to know is on this slide. So you define the user needs and resources, you collect your information, you analyze the information, and then you disseminate the intelligence. So identify and implement winning counter strategy. My counter strategy, of course, was dumpster diving. Anticipate competitive actions and evaluate the impact. Understand goals, tactics, and strategy. Monitor competitor actions. So the company must determine its key intelligence needs. Collect, analyze, and disseminate intelligence by monitoring the competition, understanding goals, strategy, and tactics. I did all that. Anticipate its actions and understand the expected impact of those actions and implement counter strategy. So that's basically the process. And you'll see this same model in your workbook. So why competitive intelligence? Play the game better. Focus on existing competitors and their strategic position. You want to leverage value chain strengths that you may have, incrementally improve existing strategies and tactics. Playing the game differently, you want to look for new market opportunities, new customers, develop and leverage new value chain strengths, and formulate new strategies and tactics. And I think, yeah, that's as far as I'm going to go, because this I want to cover tomorrow. This will take us into Porter and the 5 forces model. So we'll go through the rest of these slides tomorrow afternoon. Have a video. Then we'll go back to the book and take care. This is the second big project toolkit that you have to do. And there's a few minor ones. There's one on balanced scorecard, and we'll just kind of brief on that tomorrow. And I think that's about it. I think that's as far as we're going to go tonight. Is that okay with everybody? Oh, you don't have to thank me. I told you I'd get out of here around 8:30 or so. Go ahead.
What is the assignment for today or the presentation for tomorrow?
Okay, the group project, I'm glad you asked. In a PowerPoint presentation, you're going to look at your company's core competencies. Now, keep something in mind, and I always tell students this. It's something like, a lot of times you have a research paper you have to do for one of your MBA classes. And they'll say, tell me about the, long-term strategy of your company. And then they start to ask you all these questions that you have to include in your paper. The problem with that is maybe some of the questions they're asking you are not applicable to your company. It doesn't fit. So I always tell students, be creative. Always take that as a hypothetical. So if you can't make your company fit the question, then make the question fit some company that you make up. Does that make sense? Make it up. Same thing here with core competencies. Maybe you don't know what your core competencies are. So make 3 or 4 up. Nobody's going to know. I mean, do you think that one of your graders who grades these things is going to call up your employer and say, did he really, did they really do this? And nobody's going to do that. So make your life easier. And I'll tell you why. The whole purpose of this, the whole purpose of a research paper is to demonstrate that you have a working knowledge of the material. You don't need a real-life scenario to do that. A hypothetical, you can actually demonstrate more because you can fit the scenario to the question. Does that make sense? So, always keep that in mind. I mean, is this everybody's first class? Well, most of you. It's mostly your first class, yeah. So keep that in mind. Don't get stuck into this process where you have to fit, your employer has to fit the model for the class. It doesn't. Use hypothetical situations. I used to do this all the time. In fact, I used to actually talk about my company, Tyco, but most of the stuff in my research papers, I was making up as I went along, just so it fit the information they were looking for. Okay? Because, again, the importance of a project or a research paper is not to demonstrate your company, it's to demonstrate your understanding of the material. And you can do that easily using a hypothetical, more easily than you can sometimes using your own company. Does that make sense? So food for thought. So you're going to draw up your core competencies, and then how are they distinctive from your competition? Here, I'll even go one better. Here, our competitive advantages. Availability, 24/7, 365, multilingual, e-translation, talk to people or machines. They use artificial intelligence. Geographical coverage, available in 135 countries, 1,965 cities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of these are competitive advantages of this particular bank. Does that make sense? So this is what you're doing. Yeah. Cloud service, and so on and so on and so on. And that's what you're going to do in a PowerPoint presentation. That's an actual PowerPoint presentation from the last time I taught this class that somebody did, okay? That kind of answer your question? So do your core competencies and then compare them to your nearest competitor. And again, you can use hypotheticals, because using a hypothetical will probably make for a more robust presentation, even when you have to turn it in on the 18th of April, okay? You want it to be robust. If you limit yourself by trying to talk just about your company, there may not be enough good information in your company to make it stand out. So use hypotheticals. I mean, and there's nothing wrong with doing that. Everybody got that? Any other questions? So we're going to finish Module 3, and we're going to get into the 5 forces model, which is also in your book. So we're going to spend some time on that. There's a couple of other models they put in your book that actually weren't in there before. They added a couple for this class. And I don't know how much time we're going to have to spend on them, but what I did do is I've got some, one of them I have a website you can look up to get the information you need. So I did all that already preliminary. In fact, I did that this morning. But they did add a few things that I wasn't too happy about. They have, typically the toolkits that we had for this class was the Porter's, the pestle analysis in Porter's 5 forces model. And for some reason they put in a balanced scorecard, and they put in a couple of other things. So, but we'll cover those later in the day, and I'll give you some insight as to where you can get information for them. Some of it is in the slides, but I'll give you a website where you can get even additional information. So we're going to look at what they call the micro external environment. We looked at the macro yesterday. And that is defined as conditions in the organization's industry or the environment immediate surrounding the organization. Micro external environment conditions result from the behaviors of other organizations in your industry. Also, it looks at the suppliers to your industry. It looks at the customers of your industry. It looks at organizations attempting to enter your industry, okay? So the micro external environment is best considered by examining what we call Porter's 5 forces model. So in your book, I think I used donuts.
You always use donuts.
Yeah, I know, it's just a bad habit I have. I have a passion for donuts. But my model, I used donuts in here. Yeah, Porter's 5 forces model. Yeah, you're planning to open several donut shops in Riyadh, see? In Riyadh with potential future expansion in Saudi Arabia. So basically the Porter's 5 forces model looks at, it looks at, I'm going to show you the example. but it looks at your customers, it looks at your suppliers, it looks at your current business, what we call business rivals or competitors. Okay. It also looks at companies trying to enter your market. Okay. Market, what we call market entry. Is that a threat to your business?
Sure.
Yeah, it's threats. These are threats. And the other thing it will look at is something called substitute products. Now, the reason I use donuts is because it's very easy to explain Porter's Five Forces model using the donut process. So, obviously, customers and suppliers, okay, very important to your business. Typically, customers have much more, what's the right word I want to use? They have much more power than a supplier, typically. Do suppliers really have a lot of power? Only if they're a unique supplier. But I mean, a typical supplier, you can always find other suppliers. So typically you have more power over a supplier than the supplier would have over you, okay? Not always, but most of the time. Customers ultimately always have power because they can always go somewhere else. So you have to look at your current business rivals. You have to worry about people entering your market. And you also have to worry about somebody coming in and selling a substitute product. So if you're selling donuts, what would a substitute product be that could be a threat to your business?
Cookies.
It could be. I think the example I used was, you open a donut shop or several donut shops, and somebody comes in down the street and opens up a Cinnabon. It's the same functionality, but different product. Okay? But that's a threat to your business. Because if you're selling donuts, you're counting on people, because, and this is culturally driven, of course. Like in the United States, most people eat donuts in the morning. They come in, they get a box of donuts, cups of coffee, and they take them to work. Here, I think they eat them pretty much later in the day. But the point is, if you're counting on that business, and somebody opens up a Cinnabon store down the street from you, that's going to cut into your business, because somebody's going to come in some morning and say, gee, I could really go for one of those Cinnabons instead of a donut. Okay? So those are what we call substitute products. And it's on I'm using it on a very simple level. Okay? You can apply this to any business and any sized business. So with that said, Porter's Five Forces model represents all the significant micro external environment factors in a framework convenient for analysis. The attractiveness of an industry is determined by 5 sources of competitive pressure. You have 3 horizontal elements and 2 vertical elements. So your horizontal elements are competition from substitutes, competition from new entrants, and competition from established business rivals. The 2 vertical elements to your business would be the power of suppliers and the power of customers. And basically this is what it would look like. Anybody ever see this before? You have. So it's not a real complex model. It's also sometimes taught in marketing courses, but it usually is a piece of a strategic program. So here you have rivalry among competing firms. Here you have threat of substitute products coming into your market. Here you have a threat of entry of new competitors coming into your market. And on either side, you have to be concerned about bargaining power of suppliers and bargaining power of consumers. Excuse me, consumers or customers.
So government regulations does not apply?
Yes, they would.
But it's not mentioned anywhere here. That any government regulation, for example.
Well, remember yesterday I talked about Etisalat and do.
Yeah. But here, it's not.
No, but what government does is they put up barriers to prevent this.
Okay.
See, so it does play in here. Now we'll go, as we go through it, we'll touch on it. So, but that's what the model looks like. I'm going to go through the slides. I'll show you the video that actually has Michael Porter explaining it. And then we're going to do the exercise. So competition from substitute products. The customer's perception of the value of a product or service can depend on the availability of substitute products. The existence of close substitutes enables a customer to easily switch on the basis of differentiating factor. As an example, some people who typically go to a bookshop to buy books, okay, what's the substitute product? Online bookstores. Now, some people like online bookstores, some people prefer the old-fashioned bookshops, but one is a substitute to the other. So it is a threat. And what a lot of bookshops have done over the years is they have their own bookshops, but now they're also instituting online purchase to counteract the threat of substitute products. And this is basically driven by what we're talking about here, the customer's perceptions, okay? Now, some people like to go into a bookshop, kind of do some browsing. They can pick a book off the shelf that they might be interested in. They could go find a nice, most of those bookshops have a nice comfy couch you can sit on. Some of them have a coffee shop where you can get a cup of coffee, sit there, skim through the book, and kind of make your decision whether you want to buy the book or not. Okay? Some people like that. Other people would prefer, hey, you know, I don't even have to get out of my chair at home. I can go on Amazon, for example, and pretty much order any book I need, pay for it online, and usually within, I don't know, 5 to 7 days it gets delivered to my house. I don't even have to get off my rear end and go down to the mall. Okay? So it's basically based on customers' perceptions. Okay? Does that make sense? And what I'm showing you is these are substitutes to one another. Okay? The online bookstore was really the substitute to bookshops. I mean, years ago, probably most of you are too young to remember, but there was no such thing as online bookstores. If you wanted to buy a book, we had a number of different bookstores in the United States. Some of them are very large. They have one here. I know I've seen it, but I can't remember the name of it now. It's a big one in Saudi.
Roberts, I think.
What is it?
Robert?
Roberts, maybe. Yeah, I've seen a couple here. But years ago, that was the only way you would buy a book was to go to a bookstore. And then, of course, when the internet came in, somebody got the bright idea to have online bookstores. I think it really started with Amazon. I mean, Amazon is unlimited. You can get almost any book you could think of on Amazon. Okay? So, but some of the bigger bookstores, the national bookstores, started their own online service. But it still isn't even as good as Amazon. So that would be an example of a competition from substitute products. So the more complex the product or service, the more difficult to determine differentiation factors. Then you have the threat of entry of new businesses into your market. Okay? This is the second thing you have to consider. So basically, if you're opening up a business, first of all, you have to consider, is there going to be a threat from substitute products? Second thing you want to consider, is there going to be a threat of new entrants coming into my market and stealing my customer base? Okay? These are things you look at. So expanding companies are attracted to industries that can provide a good return on investment and have a low barrier to entry. And low barrier to entry means overly competitive or highly regulated. So if I want, like we talked about yesterday, I can't open, or I can't basically start a mobile phone service in the UAE because it's highly regulated. The government puts up a barrier to entry. Okay? They protect their business. Right? So companies are looking for types of business where there are low barriers. Some barriers can be, it may cost too much to get into a certain business. Okay? So they always are looking for low barriers to entry. So established organizations often try to create barriers to avoid the threat of new entrants. How can you do that? If you're running a donut shop, what can you do to prevent entry of another donut shop coming into your territory? Is there anything you can do?
As a government or?
No, as a business owner. You have to be very creative here. Okay?
So think if I was covered, the more
Keep going. No, you're on the right track.
If I will open and cover all districts, I will not allow them to compete. And if they will compete with one branch.
Because the more donuts you're selling, you're going into an economy of scale.
They have to come up with as many branches.
Exactly. You see, because basically what it is you would have a cost advantage. Because you could sell your donuts so cheaply, it would be very difficult for somebody to break into that market and be able to beat your price right away. Because you've spent time, so you've basically spread out. That's exactly right. That would be one way to stop it. Okay. So you have to be kind of creative here. Or, remember we talked about Porter's 3 grand strategies, right? One was cost leadership. What was the other one? Differentiation. You could maybe differentiate your product. That could make it difficult for another company to come in and compete. You know, I'm just throwing things out. Well, maybe not in donuts. You never know. So you have the barriers come up. New competitor entry versus the established industry incumbent. And some barriers can be put up by the company. Some barriers are put up by government. Okay, and we're going to look at some barriers to entry, by the way, right here. So what are some of these barriers we're talking about? Capital requirements. Economy of scale. So the more of something you're making, the cheaper you sell it for. It'd be very difficult for somebody to come in and compete against you. Capital requirements, as some businesses require so much advanced capital, that also can keep people out of a market. An absolute cost advantage that you have, maybe with suppliers. Product differentiation. Access to distribution channels. So if you have certain distribution channels kind of controlled, it can be very difficult for somebody to come in and try to compete against you. Government legal barriers, we talked about those, and and retaliation. What does that mean? I like retaliation. Huh? No. Well, yeah, you're blocking someone from coming into your market by threatening them. If you come into my market, I'll drop my prices so low, I'll blow you out of the water the first week you're in business. That's retaliation. If you come into my market. Okay? It's like a threat. Do companies do that? Huh? Rumors? Could be. Yeah, things can get nasty. So, but those are different barriers to entry into a market. Okay? Make sense?
Sometimes the suppliers help you on the retaliation.
Yeah, they can. Well, we're going to
You
talk.
can't control your supplier after.
Yeah, well,
Economy of scale,
yeah, we're going to talk about that. Particularly when you're buying a raw material that's in short supply. See, the bargaining power goes to the supplier, and they can kind of put the screws to you a little bit to drive up the price you're paying or whatever the case may be. So we're going to get to that in a minute. So methods of rivalry among competitors. So when you're competing head to head, you have direct competition, indirect competition, potential competitors, and substitutes. So direct competition is a similar product, service, or value to your market. Example, Ford versus GM. Those are direct competitors. Okay. Indirect is competition for markets with dissimilar products. What if you're in a shopping mall, in a food court? Pizza shop competes with a fried chicken shop. Those would be what we call indirect competition. And it's driven by what?
by customer.
Yeah. It all depends on what the customer feels like eating that day they're in the mall. Okay. Today I feel like Kentucky Fried Chicken. Tomorrow I might feel like Pizza Hut. Okay. That's called indirect competition. Okay. Functionality is the same, but they have dissimilar products. Okay. Everybody with me? Potential competitors, the ability to overcome entry barriers and develop synergies within your own industry. It's an old example, but years ago you had Microsoft and Nokia smartphones. Okay. Which I think failed, did they not? Miserably. Substitutes compete for the same customers but offer different functionality. Tea versus coffee. Butter versus margarine. Do they still sell margarine? Yeah, I guess they do. They don't call it margarine anymore, do they?
No.
Oh, do they?
Still call it margin.
Do they still call it margarine?
What is the difference between the substitutes and the indirect competition?
Substitutes are specifically pitted against each other. Okay? Whereas indirect competition, dissimilar products aren't really pitted against each other. It's driven by customer, what do I feel like today? Whereas tea versus coffee, people either, typically they like tea or they like coffee.
May I
Okay.
give another example for substitute? Might be easier. The
Yeah.
liquid milk and the powdered milk.
Regular milk and powdered milk? Yeah, you can use that as, that's basically, would that be yeah, that would be substitute product. Powdered milk versus regular milk.
The liquid and the powder. At the end, all milk.
But see, the difference with margarine versus butter, years ago, I don't know about here, see, in the United States, they had what they called the butter wars, okay? And the margarine manufacturers were basically advertising that butter was very bad for you because it caused high cholesterol, it caused heart attacks, and, yada, yada, yada. So those are directly, they're substitutes to one another, but they're more closely related to direct competition, okay? But as substitute products. So the funny thing is, when I was growing up, my mother always bought margarine, and I hated margarine because it tasted lousy. It had no taste at all. Today they have, I can't believe it's not butter, and it's margarine, but it tastes like butter. But years ago, margarine was terrible. And they were really beating the butter industry until all of a sudden it came out that the main ingredient that was in margarine years ago was plastic. And then people started eating butter again. Okay? But those are basically substitute products. I mean, if you have toast, you're either going to have butter or margarine. It's a substitute. If you're sitting in the morning, you're either going to have tea or you're going to have coffee. They're substitutes. Okay?
I think the substitution product, it is based on the same product. You will take it depend on the. We'll cover this I think in economy. It is based on the demand and the supply. So you will choose another product, the same product. Let's
It
say-
can be.
Yeah.
It can be driven by supply and demand.
I'm not there yet.
Huh?
I'm not there yet.
You're not there yet? Substitute products? Well, you don't really see pizza shop and a fried chicken shop really aren't substitute products.
I know.
They're dissimilar. See, margarine and butter are similar. Tea and coffee are similar. Okay? So they're more substitutes to one another. Okay?
A fried chicken can be a substitute for pizza.
Yeah, but it's a dissimilar product. Okay? I mean, I know what you're saying, but it's dissimilar. Okay? So, but those are basically the methods of rivalry among competitors. Okay? So, bargaining power of customers. So, organizations deal with two types of markets. You have markets for outputs and markets for inputs. So, selling goods or services to customers, distributors, customers, other manufacturers. We talked about this when we talked about the value chain yesterday. Okay. Customers' influence dependent upon importance of product to them and their bargaining power. Inputs is when you're purchasing raw materials, components, and financial and labor services. So a customer basically can control the outputs from your company, and you also control, in some ways, the inputs you're buying from your suppliers. Now, the suppliers, these guys typically don't have a lot of bargaining power, typically. The power balance between organization and supplier is similar to the relationship between organization and customer. So the organization becomes the customer, and the producer of the inputs it requires are the suppliers. So some small groups of suppliers, how do suppliers gain power?
If they are unique,
If they have a unique product or a rare product that they sell, that you're not going to find just anywhere. But I mean, if you're, let's say you own a Kentucky Fried Chicken franchise, I mean, you pretty much have your pick of different suppliers where you're going to buy your chicken from. Okay, so the chicken suppliers don't really have a lot of leverage. Okay, now what some suppliers have done is they form cartels or cooperatives to increase their bargaining strength. I mean, the oil cartels did that years ago. Individually, countries didn't have a lot of bargaining strength when they were selling oil. But when they all joined together in an oil cartel, all of a sudden now they had bargaining power. Okay? This happened in a very small state in the United States, in Vermont. Everybody familiar with Vermont? It's one of the smallest states. It's also one of the poorer states in the United States. It's up in the northeast corner of the United States. In fact, it borders Canada. And the biggest product in Vermont is dairy products. And what used to happen is the big package stores would go into Vermont, negotiate with the farmers, and they would buy, milk, they'd buy cheese, they'd buy butter, all dairy products. And they used to beat the farmer to death on price because they were the big package stores. They had all the power. So they'd go in and they basically were buying from individual farmers, and the farmers were really taking a beating. Well, then they got smart. All the farmers in Vermont formed a cooperative. Okay? So by joining the cooperative, now they all agreed on one set price for all their products. So when a company comes in to negotiate, they can't negotiate with the individual farmer. They have to negotiate with the cooperative. So the farmers now have much more power. Okay? Does that make sense?
Is it legal?
Oh, absolutely.
It's not considered as allegedly?
No, it's not. It's not like price fixing or anything like that. No.
So they agreed altogether that they would fix the price
Well,
for other consumers.
Well, they fix a fair price. I mean, basically, the stores don't have to buy in Vermont. They could buy their dairy products somewhere else. So it's not like they had no option.
Okay.
But the problem was for many years, the farmers were making, many of them were going out of business because they just weren't making enough profit. So the cooperatives basically were formed to protect the farmers' rights and to be able to have some kind of bargaining power against, these big supermarket chains like Walmart and Kroger and Safeway. They go in there and they just blow these people away. Okay? So now they had a little more bargaining power that got their prices up, and it was a much more fair exchange. But without the cooperative, they had no bargaining power. Okay?
What are the difference between cartels and unions?
Well, a union is basically formed to represent employees. Okay? Cartels are formed to basically represent producers, sellers of product. Okay? Like oil cartel. So suppliers use leverage occasionally, such as threats, to raise prices or reduce quantity or quality of goods they supply. As an example, again, if you're running a chicken restaurant and there's only really one chicken supplier in your immediate vicinity, and let's say you're ordering so many kilos of chicken every month, your supplier calls you up and says, hey, I'm sorry, but going forward, I can only give you half of your normal monthly order. Well, you're going to go into a panic. How are you going to run your business? Well, why? Well, I'm selling my chicken now to other businesses. Well, what can we do? Well, if you're willing to pay me more money per kilo, I might be able to still meet your demands. Okay? So sometimes that can happen. Usually when you don't have a number of suppliers to pick from, suppliers do use leverage. Okay? Make sense? That was fairly simple. One of the things that's not in the Porter Five Forces model is called complements. Complementary products that enhance or add value to existing products. The level of value is determined by the relationship between the provider of the principal product or service and the provider of the complementary product. So examples would include things like software complements by a separate manufacturer that is utilized by Microsoft Windows operating system. Microsoft Windows is the complementary proprietary operating system of most computer manufacturers. Okay? And if you think about it, in fact, Microsoft has been sued many times for antitrust violations. Okay? So when you buy, typically when you buy any computer except an Apple, pretty much, it's going to have Microsoft operating system on it, correct? Pretty much. Pretty much. That's a complementary product. And Microsoft's argument against what the governments were, well, we're not forcing ourselves. It's the computer manufacturers are providing what their consumers want, and they want Microsoft operating system. Okay, so
They have to be paid eventually.
they've been sued in different countries. I know European Union was after them, huh?
For the Internet Explorer.
Oh, yeah,
And another one.
yeah. I think it was wasn't it up against Netscape or something?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was Internet Explorer versus Netscape. Netscape was suing them for monopolistic practice.
I cannot recall it, but I believe that they paid.
Yeah, I think they did too.
Yeah.
Well, Microsoft is not without sin. I mean, they play hardball. Okay, so anyway, that's called complementary products. Let me show you the video. This is the actual Michael Porter in the flesh.
I'm Tom Stewart, editor and managing director of the Harvard Business Review. Our guest today is Michael Porter, professor at Harvard University and head of the Institute for Strategy and Competitiveness. He's the author of the forthcoming HBR article, The 5 Competitive Forces That Shape Strategy, a reaffirmation, update, and extension of his groundbreaking 1979 article, How Competitive Forces Shape Strategy. Mike, thanks for joining the program. To start, let's remind our viewers of what the 5 competitive forces are.
Well, Tom, the basic idea of the competitive forces starts with the notion that competition is often looked at too narrowly by managers. And the 5 forces say that, yes, you're competing with your direct competitors, but you're also in a fight for profits with a broader, extended set of competitors, customers, who have bargaining power, suppliers who can have bargaining power, new entrants who might come in and kind of grab a piece of the action, and substitute products or services that essentially place a constraint or a cap on your profitability and growth. So the 5 forces is kind of a holistic way of looking at any industry and understanding the structural underlying drivers of profitability and competition.
So I use these to think about my rival makes it difficult for me. The threat of substitutes means I can't overcharge. The threat of new entrants means I can't overcharge.
Right.
And the same thing with the
buyers
power
and suppliers.
suppliers.
There's underlying drivers of each of those forces that the model really sort of unveils, and then you can actually apply this. Every industry is different. Every industry will have a different set of economic fundamentals, but the 5 forces help you home in on, first of all, what's really causing profitability in your industry, what are the trends that are the most likely to be significant in changing the game in the industry, where are the constraints which if you can relax them might allow you to find a really strong competitive position.
So how would you apply this analysis to an industry, airlines, for example?
Well, airlines is a great industry. It's actually, you'll see in the article, you've seen in the article, that there's a chart that compares profitability of industries, and airlines, I think, has been on the bottom of that list for decades. It's among the least profitable industries known to man. And the 5 forces really allows you very quickly to understand why. I mean, let's just go around the chart. The nature of rivalry is incredibly intense, and it's almost exclusively on price. It's been very hard to differentiate, to get the customer to wait even an extra 2 or 3 minutes for another flight if they can get on the flight at a cheaper price. So there's been a very intense price competition, low barriers to entry, a constant stream of new airlines coming into the industry, despite the fact that the profitability is low. It's always puzzled me.
The low barriers to entry because you can rent a plane, you don't have to
can
buy
rent a
them.
plane.
lease them
You can
very
rent a
easily.
plane. You can lease a gate. It's all generic technology. You can start with one flight between two city pairs. You don't have to. There's no real need to have a whole network in the beginning. And yet people keep coming in. I think it's just one of those sexy industries. It's a great example of how sexiness or coolness or hotness or chicness has nothing to do with industry profitability. The underlying structure is what drives profitability. The customer is very fickle and price sensitive. Suppliers of aircraft and aircraft engines and even aircraft gates at airports now have a lot of clout. They can bargain away most of the profits. GE and Rolls-Royce and Airbus and Boeing make a lot more money than airlines. They get most of the profit. And then, of course, there's always a substitute of getting on the train or driving your car or shipping your goods by air, and that's kind of kept a concern.
And you have powerful suppliers of labor too. That's another powerful supplier.
Right, exactly. There's a great case where you have unionized labor, and unlike other industries, in this industry, particularly with the pilots, the labor can literally shut you down, and there's no way around them. So it's an industry where there are spurts of what you might call mediocre profitability, punctuated by long periods of terrible profitability.
So every one of the five forces is very strong in that industry.
Yep.
And you could take another industry where the five forces are relatively benign in all cases.
Like soft drinks. I mean, soft drinks has been a license to mint money, and again, it's the opposite kind of analysis. When I talk with students, we kind of joke around. There's five-star industries where all the forces are attractive, like soft drinks. There's zero-star industries where all the forces are unfavorable, like airlines. And we're always trying to understand, okay, what's the configuration of underlying economic drivers that's going to really shape the profit potential of this industry? And then armed with that insight, what do I do about it? How do I try to relax the constraint that's holding back industry profitability? How can I position myself to kind of insulate from some of the gale winds of those forces? And those implications of the five forces are something that this new article has developed in much more detail.
You conceived this framework nearly 3 decades ago, and it has been the most extensively used both in management scholarship and management practice of any strategy framework, and I mean, it really has it changed the definition of strategy in a lot of ways. In these 3 decades, what have you learned? What have you learned about the application of these ideas in the real world of business?
Well, the wonderful thing, of course, we learned is that these concepts can be applied to literally any industry. It's a product, a service, high tech, low tech, emerging economies, developed economies. Indeed, what one of the powers of the framework is it helps you avoid getting trapped or tricked by the latest trend or the latest technological sensation, and really allows you to focus on the underlying fundamentals. The internet's a good example. We got very, very confused by the internet because people saw the internet as a force as opposed to really enabling technology that might or might not impact the underlying structure of the industry. So I think one thing I've learned is the framework is very, very robust. But I've also learned that there's a lot of confusion and complexity in actually applying the framework in actual practice, and we've tried to clear as many of those areas up as we could in this new article. For example, how to think about rivalry. How do we understand when rivalry is really positive sum, which allows companies to, many companies to do well, and when does rivalry become really zero sum, where everybody's kind of dragged down into kind of a destructive battle that you can't win? That's
I can understand zero sum. I mean, if we get in a price war, the only one who wins is the consumer, which is nice if you're a consumer.
Yep.
But what do you mean by positive sum competition?
Well, the trouble with the zero-sum competition is then the consumer gets a low price, but they really get no choice. And a positive-sum competition is where companies can compete on different attributes, services, features, customer support, that's actually relevant to particular groups of customers. And the most really positive-sum competition is where companies are really competing on different things in order to meet the needs of different segments of
So we're growing the
customers.
pie, and there's a piece for each of us.
There's a piece of us. In fact, one of the things we talk about in the new article, one of the things I did in the new article that we really probably didn't have the experience to do so many years ago was really talk a lot about the implications. If this is the way competition works, what do you do about it? And one of them might be, in some industries, rather than go for market share against your rivals, you might be much better off just really expanding the pie, expanding the whole profit pool of the industry. That may be the best way for a market leader to actually improve their circumstances rather than to trigger a destructive battle with their head-to-head rival.
How should a company get started using the 5 Forces framework? You're working your strategy up, you decide this really works for me. How do you begin?
Well, I think industry analysis and looking at the competitive environment is, of course, probably the starting basic discipline of any strategy formulation process. If you don't know what your industry looks like, if you don't know how it's changing, if you don't know what the drivers of competition are, you might as well, strategy is going to be, marginally useful if not destructive. So we got to start with industry analysis. Figuring out what your industry is and drawing the right boundaries.
And that's not always easy.
It's not always easy. We've added a box in this new article which really addresses that question because I encountered so many companies that struggled with industry definition. Identifying really what the industry structure is in your particular industry. And then there's another thing that a lot of managers do. They kind of go through the industry analysis and they say, okay, this is good, this is bad, this is good, this is bad. So this is a attractive industry or an unattractive industry. But of course, the real question is, how's that industry changing? Some have taken the 5 Forces as really a static snapshot. But of course, the 5 Forces give you the tools for understanding the dynamics and where's that industry structure changing, how are buyers and suppliers and substitutes and potential entry evolving, and then what implications does that hold for your strategy? How do you position yourself to find that spot within the industry that you're where you can command a really good profit given the 5 Forces? How can you maybe reshape the nature of the industry structure? And we've got some great new examples that are very, very contemporary in this article that I think will help the manager community and the investor community really understand the application of this.
Sometimes when people think about strategy, they think about a group of people, maybe from a management consulting firm or maybe on the 33rd floor of the building, whatever it is, but this sort of elite strategy priesthood that goes and does this, and they're almost divorced from the rest of the management of the company, the 99% of the other people working in the company. How can a strategy become part of the day-to-day life of a working stiff manager in a company? How do you apply this framework, this thinking? How do you use it?
Well, we think that this way of looking at an industry needs to be very, very broadly understood in the organization. I mean, and the thing about it is that managers, even rank and file employees, it's intuitive. People understand. We have these customers, we have these suppliers. We're struggling with them every day. They're trying to get a better deal. We're trying to get a better deal. So intuitively, I think this is a way of helping people sort of step back from all the excruciating little details that characterize any business and say, what's really important here? And then, of course, we've learned that strategy is completely useless, again, unless the results of the strategy process, the position that you choose to occupy, the way you're going to drive your company, is well understood quite broadly. Because the number one purpose of strategy is alignment. It's really to get all the people in the organization making good choices, reinforcing each other's choices, because everybody's pursuing a common value proposition, a common way of gaining competitive advantage. So, I remember when I wrote this article, there were many people who believed that strategy documents should be locked in the safe at night. And should not be made available to the rank and file. There was a concern that some competitor would find some secret. Well, we've actually learned now that it's the opposite. You've got your employees got to know your strategy, your channels have to know your strategy, your suppliers have to know your strategy,
and your competitors probably knew it already.
Well, and frankly, if again, the competition is not zero sum. If every company finds a unique need that it can set out to meet, if it tries to deliver something different than its rivals, multiple rivals can be successful. And if your competitors kind of understand what you stand for and what you're committed to, maybe they'll make a different choice rather than get dragged into these kind of mindless price wars that we see in so many industries.
The 5 forces that shape strategy have been around for 30 years. They're going to be around for Well, they've been around. They've been around for long. They were around long before you wrote about them.
That's right.
They've been around as long as business has been around. They're going to be around as long as business is around. The new article is just fabulous, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, I'm looking forward to kind of getting another surge of feedback from the practitioners, and we'll keep learning.
Thanks.
Thanks, Tom.
And the scenario, as I mentioned before, as a business investment, you are planning to open several donut shops in Riyadh with potential future expansion plans in other areas in Saudi Arabia, including Jeddah, Dammam, Khobar, and Al Hafuf. Is that right? Your initial plan will offer a wide variety of donuts and assorted beverages, coffee, tea, juices, etc. Currently, the only competitors you will face in these locations are two global organizations, with no local competitors in the market for those locations. Realizing that the current customer market may well support a local business that can successfully
First step in
complete in
the
those targeted
business
cities,
strategy
you
plan
begin to
is to
build a
conduct an
business
analysis,
plan.
utilizing the
Business
principles of Ford's
strategy
five
plan is
forces
conduct an
model
analysis,
and applying each to
utilizing
determine the
principles of
strategic
Ford's
impact
five forces
of
model.
each element.
So, you're going to look at rivalry among direct competitors, the existing donut shops. And the two existing donut shops would obviously be who? Who's already here? The big ones. Dunkin' Donuts, Krispy Kreme. Yeah. Risk of market entry of new competitors, new donut shops attempting to enter your market. Risk of market entry of substitute products, different products, similar functionality. Bargaining power of suppliers, who you will buy your raw materials from. Bargaining power of buyers, your customers who you will target to buy your product. Okay? And then you have a series of questions. Consider each of these principles as they relate to your proposed business. Who are your direct competitors? How can you compete against them? And you can use Porter's grand competitive model to define your strategy. And if you remember, that's in your slides. That was cost leadership, differentiation, and focus market. So you can use one or more of those. 2, what are the chances of other donut shops entering your market over the next year? 2 years, 5 years. How can you minimize the threat? What risks exist of someone entering your market with a substitute product? What substitute products could be offered that would compete with your product? And what strategy can you use to minimize the threat? 4, how can you maintain leverage over both your suppliers? How can you maintain your customer base? So you break into teams and so on. So this is going to be a two-person team again. By the way, just as a side note, this actually happened to Dunkin' Donuts. Dunkin' Donuts had 2 major substitute products come in and compete against them. One, of course, was Cinnabon. And I don't know about here, but in some countries, there was another place that opened up called La Boulangerie. Anybody ever hear that? They sell homemade, fresh, hot croissants. Anybody know how Dunkin' Donuts fought that substitute product threat? Huh? Well, they increased their range of products, which included cinnamon buns and croissants. It was a very smart strategy, okay? That's how they fought off the substitute products, okay? So when people came to Dunkin' Donuts, it was kind of like one-stop shopping. Oh, you don't have to go to La Boulangerie if you want a croissant. You don't have to go to Cinnabon. We have it right here, okay? So anyway, just this kind of a side note you might want to incorporate into your, just like to throw those hints out, make it easier for you, okay? So, everybody got that? What time is it? 20 to 3. We have our first prayer break at 3:15? All right, well, let's go to 3:15. You can work on this. This is when you're obviously going to be turning in. And the other ones are kind of minor stuff. We'll touch on those later. Okay? These are the 2 big ones. All right, so you can work in teams like you did yesterday. Just think donuts. And the model is in there, so if you have to refer to the Five Forces model, it's there with some guidelines.
So this, we have submitted in a soft copy, right, later?
Yes, this is one of the things, anything that's in this book, you will be submitting as a soft copy on the 18th of April. Okay? Anything that's in the workbook, you submit as a hard copy the first day of your new class.
So even these scenarios,
Huh?
even these scenarios that we are.
Yeah, all of those have to be submitted. That's all coursework. I'm sorry. Yes, in addition to the final assignment. These are what we call the toolkits. Yeah. I'm sorry, what? Yeah, in a Word document is fine. Yeah, absolutely. So basically, you do the preliminary now, and then so when you go to sit down to do it, you'll at least have some kind of an outline, and yeah, you might want to clean it up, make some changes. It will take time in class to do it.
The Porter's free.
The what?
The Porter's free, number 5. Before you mentioned the 3 forces for the Porter.
They're in the workbook.
Yeah. No, this the 5 model.
Yeah.
5 forces. I'm talking about the 3.
Oh, value chain?
Value chain, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that was inputs, throughputs, and outputs.
Okay, not that. No.
Okay. Oh, the grand competitive strategies. Is that what you were talking about? Because I have it mentioned in there. Cost leadership. Yeah, I got you. Now I know where you're going. I'll tell you what. I'll put them up here. They're in the slides, but I'll put them up here. Okay? And you can differentiate donuts, by the way. You just have to be creative.
This here, the 5 questions, should we answer it or we should incorporate it in our answer?
No, incorporate that in the
In the answer.
the 4 answers, yeah.
'Cause it's
Yeah.
direct.
Yeah, basically you have four questions you're answering. Huh? Focus market. Niche market. Remember we talked about niche markets?